The culmination of layers on layers of ruffles on ruffles, extravagant bows delicately placed on a lacy bodice, intricate hair pieces, and a skirt that resembles a beautifully decorated cupcake. It isn't rare to see this image while walking through the streets of Harajuku, Japan, a hub for all types of alternative fashion, where you're most likely to see Lolitas roaming the street. With multiple different substyles and dresses to choose from, Lolita fashion combines Victorian Rococo fashion trends with Japanese flair in order to create a modern-day princess. Alternatively, what might come to mind when thinking about Lolita is a young slim girl sporting the iconography of lollipops, stuffed animals, and schoolgirl outfits, looks seen on celebrities such as Madonna, Britney Spears, and Taylor Swift. This imagery was created by director Stanley Kubrick in his 1962 adaptation of Lolita and has since become vastly popularized and used in American audiovisual media. Nonetheless, the image of Lolita in Japan and the Lolita in America create two vastly different images and effects on their respective popular culture. But how is it that both Japan and the West have created two completely different definitions of the term Lolita in the first place? How, if even, did Nabokov's Lolita evolve to create different representations of Lolita in both Western and Japanese culture? In this video, we will explore how Nabokov's Lolita created a culture of infantilizing women through the popularization of coquette fashion in the West and the portrayal of the ideal woman in film and music, as well as discuss how Japan's pre-established infatuation with the social archetype prevented Nabokov's Lolita from impacting their popular culture in the same way it did in America. In order to preface where differences arise between cultures, we can look at social psychologist Serge Moscovici's works, particularly a book he released in 2000 explaining his social representation theory. He said, as representations emerge in society through forms of communication, they eventually become a common sense view. And so, Moscovici explains that different cultures can develop different socially significant representations. In order for them to change, it must be in accordance with the culture's changing significances. So just as the West had its own interpretation of Nabokov's Lolita, Japan had its own as well. But before I begin to discuss how each country developed their own definitions of the term Lolita, let's talk about the book I keep mentioning. In 1955, a tragic comedy novel by the name Lolita was written by the seasoned writer Vladimir Nabokov, quickly becoming one of his most iconic and most controversial works. The novel is narrated in first person by the protagonist of the novel, Humbert Humbert, recounting his affairs with Dolores, who's more commonly known as Lolita. Humbert Humbert was a 37-year-old man who had run away with 12-year-old Lolita. They were constantly on the move in an attempt to hide their identities and their incestuous pedophilic relationship. Even one of the editors, Pascal Covici, believed that the publication would land them in prison. However, it is important to note in this video that the impact Kubrick's film adaptation had on American popular culture far outweighs that of the novel in the ways each version chose to portray the pedophilic relationship between Humbert Humbert and Lolita. While Lolita has a wide variety of adaptations made since its introduction to the West, we'll be cross-referencing the most popular of these, Stanley Kubrick's 1962 Lolita film adaptation. Because since its release to American audiences, Kubrick's Lolita has become an everlasting icon with her heart-shaped sunglasses, primarily seen worn by many popular celebrities since, including Madonna and Taylor Swift. But before we delve into some of the research I've done, let's take a sneak peek at the Lolita culture in Japan. Lolita fashion is based on modesty, giving rise to covered shoulders, long sleeves, pairs of tights, and knee-high socks for accessories. The fashion is highly influenced by French Rococo and Victorian fashion trends and has multiple subdivision aesthetics, ranging from hime, which means princess, to Gothic styles. The style broke into the mainstream through the success of visual K-bands in the 1990s, particularly Malice Mizer, whose guitarist Mono went on to create a Lolita clothing brand. The interactions they had with their fan base through Lolita fashion opened up the way for fashion brands to work with the style and create Lolita-style garments. And while it is important to give credit where it's due, there is a deeper, more meaningful reason behind the rise of Lolita fashion. Unlike in much of the West, where adulthood is seen as a period of freedom, in Japan, adulthood is viewed by many young people as a gloomy period of heavy burdens. Lolita fashion was an indirect form of rebellion against key Japanese societal norms, including self-discipline, self-sacrifice, and hard work. In conditions where children are unable to express themselves both in and out of class due to societal expectations, it can begin to suffocate them. When they face so much pressure from their parents and fellow peers to succeed, it can have the opposite effect, and thus began the Lolita movement in the 1970s. The Lolita movement was also a revolt against clothing that emphasized the female body. Following the 1800s, the Meiji era was the first to experience full interaction with the West, after Japan had opened up in 1853, and since has been drawing inspiration from Western clothing styles. Many Japanese women felt they had a hard time living up to Western style standards of the mid-1980s and found a welcome alternative in Lolita fashion. Both the style and mindset followed by these women was inspired by the Victorian era. Unlike their innocent and modest appearances, Victorian women were much different behind closed doors, and this is the lifestyle that many Lolitas wanted to emulate, upholding a youthful and modest facade despite what their inner personalities might truly be. Lolita were also inspired by the Rococo era's obsession with detail and frivolity, but that in reality, Lolita didn't care much about how authentic their looks were to either of these eras. The purpose of dressing in Lolita fashion was to create a world happier than the real one. So now that you have a general idea of what the term Lolita signifies in Japan, you might come to realize that unlike the impact it had on American pop culture, Lolita had little to no impact on Japanese popular media. In fact, this is also due to an already similar archetype existing within its culture, the shoujo, a Japanese archetype of a young unmarried female character who represents uncorrupted innocence and beauty. With the arrival of Nabokov's Lolita in Japan, the country's pre-established shoujo archetype left no space for a novel that depicted illicit relationships with a similar character to be accepted and adopted as a major component in their pop culture. In contrast, you could say that the American counterpart of Japan's Lolita, embracing the shoujo archetype, would be portrayed through coquette fashion, which rose to popularity in America after Kubrick's Lolita adaptation. It encompassed hyperfemininity and included wearing lacy dresses, bows, Mary Janes, and hearts in order to be more girly. Usually those who dress in coquette fashion follow similar hobbies, including reading, baking, and listening to Lana Del Rey. While it seems like such a harmless subculture, it unintentionally encourages the infantilization of women and panders to pedophiles. Innocence, petiteness, and looking as childlike as possible are valued traits. An even bigger problem, many young women and girls who religiously follow coquette fashion tend to romanticize relationships with older men. Lolita transcended her textual innocence and became an icon of youthful desirability for many of these young girls and women. In turn, this means that coquette girlies idolize the glamorized and refashioned Lolita displayed by agents of American popular media, who had actually turned the manipulated 12-year-old into a vamp, ways away from the young girl that sobbed every night while her abuser feigned sleep in the novel. So just like the coquette girls who had been molded by the media to infantilize themselves subconsciously through fashion and body weight for the attention of older men, it may be argued by others that young girls are taking example and doing the same, primarily caused by the distorted portrayal of the ideal body in American media, while in reality, many factors such as the child's family dynamic have a more direct impact on their behavior. The purpose of this video isn't to villainize women who prefer a youthful or childlike look, nor criticize young girls experimenting with more revealing clothes, but instead to begin to offer insight on why prepubescent female bodies are so often sexualized in the media. Unfortunately, pedophilic ideals have been buried within our society. Women, as a result, continue to face various challenges in winning the approval of what society expects of them. In a patriarchal society, women are constantly pressured to fit within a mold created by males. This has even affected young girls who are exposed to the various messages that our media contains. In turn, I simply hope to shed light on the effects that the media has on a young girl's perception of herself, in hopes that maybe someday girls don't feel like the only way to be validated is by fitting the male gaze. That way, they can begin to truly find themselves using fashion. Thank you.